Today I'm going to go through some dynamic and static stretching drills that I use basically for my hips, whether I've been climbing, cycling and doing weight training, any other activity. Now you can perform these stretches before an activity, and of course you can perform the stretches after activity. So what is the difference between dynamic and static stretching? To put it in layman's terms, static stretching, when you bring a muscle out to the end range of movement, in this case I'm stretching the chest muscles, and I hold that position for a period of time. Whereas dynamic, you tend to use movement to come in and out of the stretch. Of course, you can combine both of those techniques to have a very effective stretching regime. Also as well, when I'm stretching, personally, I like to use props when I'm working with clients, or indeed I'm performing my own stretching routine. And the props I like to have around, particularly for the drills I'm just about to undergo, i.e. hip flexor stretching and mobility drills. I like to have some blocks, yoga blocks, and also I like to have a 30 centimetre tall foam roller. So that's a great bit of kit for all sorts of purposes, foam rolling, support where you're stretching, etc. So let's very quickly go through my schedule that I do most days, and this is just part of the schedule. I do actually stretch and mobilise for at least 10 to 15 minutes a day, sometimes even more. So I'm just going to give you a brief excerpt of some of the drills that I use that I think you'll find quite useful. So first of all, starting off with the combination hip flexor, in this case iliopsoas and hamstring stretch. So I get into this position here, keep my spine neutral, head tall. A little trick to keep your head in the correct position is you put your finger on your chin and just move your chin away from your finger, and you automatically start to engage the muscles of the posterior chain, and you have your head in the correct position. Neutral lumbar spine, pelvis facing forward. I take an inhale and I exhale, gently ease into that stretch. Then I come back, and then I can position my other leg forward, keep the lower back flat, and a hinge from the hips, and keep the lower back flattish in a stretch to get into the hamstrings. Then I repeat that process maybe another 6 times, and I'll swap across the other leg. You can do more if you have time. It all depends what you've been doing previously. If you're nice and warm and mobile, maybe 6 will be enough. Now this is where the foam roller can come in particularly handy, because we're doing this particular stretch here. Hip flexor is not normally too much a problem, but when you're coming back and then you're hinging into your hamstrings, it becomes a little bit of a balance exercise. So you may just wish to have your hand on a foam roller or a chair or anything really, but foam roller is so light and easy to move around that you can use the foam roller to assist you as you come down into this position. You can play around with the stretch as well, different feel for the hamstrings by pointing the toes, get different parts of the hamstrings here. We do this. Less emphasis in the insertion below the knees, and getting more into the bicep femoris as you do this. Then we come out then, and then from there we can just relax, and we'll move on to the next version of the stretch where I go even deeper into the hips. Now from here, what I like to do, as far as I can, I like to keep my back flat. It's not absolutely imperative to keep my back flat, but if someone has disc problems, i.e. a bulging disc, going into flexion and even a little bit can be a wee bit uncomfortable for them. So you want to make sure you are stretching without forcing anything and in reasonable comfort. So I use yoga blocks here just to keep my back flat. And you see there, I've actually got both hands on the yoga blocks, like so. So I can keep the back relatively flat, so I can just focus and get into that stretch. So I'm really focusing what's going on in the hips here. Gently working into the iliopsoas. And this is a dynamic stretch because, as I say, I'm using movement to come into the stretch and then obviously using it to come out. A static version of this, of course, would be coming right into stretch, holding this position even more. And I normally recommend 30 to 60 seconds for a static stretch. Of course, you can't hold it for longer, but 30 to 60 seconds is what the American College of Sports Medicine recommend. Obviously 60 seconds for the older guys like myself. And then you come out Now you can also combine that, obviously you can do a few dynamic stretches to find where you feel your end range is, end range of a stretch, and then of course you can hold a static stretch. Now I want to take it a little bit further. I can then straighten my back leg out, like so. I'll come up to this position here. Now it's a little bit more serious. Obviously, you've got to make sure you're ready for this particular stretch. It's not something you rush into straight away, it's a progression. Keep it back as flat as I can. Inhale, exhale, gently sink into that stretch. As I say, keeping the back leg relatively straight. And if I demonstrate it from this side, you get more of an idea of my hand position on these blocks. And the fact that it assists me in keeping my back relatively flat. Relatively flat. So from there, head in line with spine, gently going into that stretch. Now if you haven't got disc issues, the theory, you can come down and you can stretch like this with a rounded back, a reasonably rounded back. But we want to try and avoid that. It's always a good idea to try and stretch with a neutral spine position as far as you can. You're not always going to be able to do that, but if you have disc problems, you've got to be extremely aware of going into flexion when you're doing stretches like these. Now moving on from there then, the next area I will look at is stretching the external rotators here of the hip. The drill I like to use is very similar to setup that we use for the initial hip flexor stretch. I use blocks for these because mainly I just want to keep my back flat once again. And what I want to do this time, if you notice my hip flexor stretch, if you can visualise I had my knee on one railway line and my foot on another railway line, and the railway lines were parallel. That's more or less how you set it up, give or take. Now, with this particular stretch, because I'm working into the external rotator, what I'm actually going to do is have this foot here positioned directly in line with the knee. And I have my blocks for a little bit of support. That's so I can keep my back flat when I go into the stretch. So let me show you the setup from the side. Here's the blocks for support. There's one foot, then the other, knee behind, fairly close to. I note the position of my hands here. My back, as I say, is relatively flat. Pelvis facing forward, and I have to adjust a wee bit here just to get into that correct position. Take an inhale, back flat, exhale, come forward, push the knee gently out. Exhale. And with all these stretches as well, I'm getting to the end range of movement. If I want to, I can now engage in a static contraction. Okay, so you can combine dynamic and static, and I'll cover a little bit more in the pros and cons of that a little bit later on. So you come back, forward, push the knee out, chest forward, back as flat as you can, particularly if you have got disc issues. Okay, from there then, once I become more adept at that stretch, I can go even deeper if I wish. So we come into this position here, lift this back leg up, and this time, as you can see there, I'm going to be sinking into my hips, and at the same time engaging the external rotation, the external rotators, whilst keeping my back relatively flat. So push out, like so, head in line with the spine, gently easing in. Inhale to get ready, and I tend to exhale to ease into the stretch, as I do with most dynamic stretches. There we go, a few of those. Okay, so that's my hip getting nicely warmed up now. Obviously I repeat the process on the other side. 6 to 10 of those would be a reasonable number to aim for. But bear in mind, you'd be building up to this. You wouldn't necessarily perform this in your first session. You'd just get used to the first stage, and over time you build up over weeks till you can get right into your hips. But of course, be careful with these stretches. Take your time. Now, we can actually open up the hips and combine a shoulder and hip flexor stretch now. So I'm just going to show you that. From here then, once again, a block for a little bit of support. I'm going to rock forward, like so, come into a bit of a stretch. And you can see here, I've got my left knee out. I'm going to bring my right foot up, and this time I'm going to be working into the right rectus femoris, the superficial hip flexor. So I've got to do this. So it's the deep hip flexor now into rec fem. Grab my ankle like so. And I'm going to rock forward. I'm going to push this knee out. I'm now going to work into my shoulders a little bit now. So using the blocks for support, I'm just going to gently rotate, almost like try to get my breastbone towards the ceiling as I come into that stretch there. Okay, this is a little bit more advanced, so you probably would have mastered the previous stretches quite easily, I would have thought. There you go, rotations, I'm getting into external rotation, pushing them out, and at the same time stabilising that bottom shoulder and keep my back relatively flat. And if I show you from this side, from the opposite side should I say, you'll see just how much work's going into that rec fem. So from there then, across the opposite side of the mat, position myself like so. There's the position, and now look how much work's going into that rec fem. And the pressure's coming off my knee, and I'm rocking forward into my hip. And there you go. External rotate, external rotate, external rotate, get long, gently dropping into hips. Of course, you can do it dynamically, nice and easy. It doesn't have to be fast by dynamic stretch. And then of course you can hold it at the end range movement statically, breathe, relax, then come out of that particular position. Okay, so I've covered the hip flexors, hamstrings, external rotators. How about anything that will be useful for the groin? A stretch I use quite frequently is called the frog, or froggies. So from here then, I come onto my forearms this time. I get my knees wide, but I get my ankles wider still. So I go very carefully with this movement. Forearms down, don't force it. I take an inhale, coming forward. Notice how my head's in line with my spine. Exhale, sit back into that stretch. I'm gently getting into the groin muscles. So I tend to get a full complement of groin muscles there from adductor longus all the way to magnus. And I can sit back into stretch and hold a static stretch for a little while if I want. Then relax into it and then start a little bit more dynamic work. Gently into frog. Notice, of course, that you see that my feet are going to be slightly wider than my knees. One more, there's the froggies. And of course, all these stretches, they can be performed dynamically or statically. Same with the hamstrings. Over a period of time, you can become very effective at going into almost in the split position if you're mobile enough. If you need to do that, you probably wouldn't unless you're a gymnast or an advanced rock climber. You got that support there, of course, and you get to hold a static stretch, and then you come back further, getting that back flat as you can, sitting back into stretch, and then you can hold it. Or you can come in and out of it like so, very easily, quasi dynamic. One more, and then you can hold that in position for 30 to 60 seconds. As I say, you can have as many blocks as you want for support, or if you're happier, of course, you can bring in the foam roller, and that will make life even easier, this particular drill. So you see it there. Then you can bring a knee back a bit further, and over time, you can always start to work towards a split position. I like to stretch as well with my toes going towards my shins, so I get a little bit of the calf complex as well when I do this particular drill. So dynamic, not much a range of movement, but still dynamic by definition. And then perhaps you may want to finish off with a static hold. Okay folks, so there is the drills, the basic drills I use before I start to do my hip flexor and hamstrings, external rotators and groin stretches. Now, also as well, before I go into that particular drills, I want to make sure I'm properly warmed up. Maybe going for a jog, did a bit of aerobics, even a light bike ride would be handy, or a walk, anything of that nature, just to get the heat into the joints, if you like, so you produce synovial fluid. And one of the drills I like to do before I even start stretching, I'm going to show you at the end now, but it's just a reminder really, is a 90-90 drill. So beat my walk, I've done a bit of aerobics or whatever I find warms me up easier. And then I go into the 90-90 drill. Yeah, so I'm specifically targeting the hip joints here, because all the muscles run about the hip joint to be stretched. I want to make sure as well that's got the ability to move as well, so that the joint capsules will also get a little bit of a stretch, no doubt, but you've got to warm them up first. And what I'm doing here, I can do anything up to 10 to 20 of those, so just to get movement, friction, heat, and encourage the synovial fluid within the joint. Okay, so that's what I normally do as a precursor warm up before I do my hip flexibility drills and hip mobility drills. Now, on the subject of static and dynamic stretching, which is best? Well, the arguments are quite nuanced at the moment. There's some schools of thought who say that if you perform static stretching before you do powerful movements, for instance a power clean or a deadlift or anything of that nature, requires power and strength, your ability to perform that movement is going to be inhibited to a certain extent because you've stretched statically beforehand. And those individuals, or those schools of thought, should I say, recommend that you always do dynamic stretching, because there's no drop off in power and strength when you come to perform the movement. Particularly if you're playing something like basketball or volleyball, where you're looking at very dynamic movements. However, there's another school of thought, and research has been done in this, to suggest actually static stretching doesn't really make much difference, provided you rewarm the body prior to activity, and you give yourself a reasonable amount of time between the last time you did your static stretching and before you rewarmed, perhaps jogged around the basketball court, etc., did a few layups before you actually started your match. You'd probably find you would have the benefits of static stretching without actually losing the power and strength decrement that has been reported by previous studies. And as I say, the arguments, I wouldn't say they rage, but it's not cut and dried. Okay, it's certainly not cut and dried. Incidentally as well, the science also suggests stretching and mobilization is extremely good for getting your joints into the correct position so you can apply the muscle power required to perform a movement effectively. But funnily enough, there isn't a lot of research that suggests that stretching actually prevents injury. So that's an interesting one to ponder over. However, I will keep you up to date with any new research that I come across. In the meantime, go away and practice these particular drills slowly and carefully. And as also as a caveat here, if you have any reason to suspect that you're unfit to undergo any form of physical training, including stretching and mobilization, please consult your GP before you do any of these exercises, because you are responsible for your own health. In the meantime, take care.